Let me introduce our speaker. Bill James has degrees in English, economics, and education. He's the author of more than 24 books on topics which range from baseball statistics to crime. He's widely considered a leading figure in the field of sabermetrics, which uses statistics to analyze baseball news. He's the inventor of many of the most important statistics used by baseball enthusiasts and analysts, such as the runs created statistic, range factor, and win shares. He was instrumental in the creation of Project Scoresheet, a grassroots movement to collect baseball statistics in a time when Major League Baseball made it very difficult to access baseball records. And his work sparked a revolution in baseball, which has been modeled in several other fields, and was the subject of the book Moneyball. For the last 12 years, he's been a senior advisor on baseball operations for the Boston Red Sox, who have won 3 World Series championships in that time. His latest book, Popular Crime, is available from the bookstore outside. It was published in 2011, and it explores how crime has influenced our culture over the past few centuries. In 2006, Time magazine named him one of the most influential people in the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Bill James.
I asked Dr. Marmerstein for a list of people that I should thank at the beginning of my talk, because that is usually the way I begin a talk. And he said, well, I'm going to thank them all. So rather than double thank people, I will just thank Dr. Marmerstein, who has put in heroic efforts trying to get my attention and coordinating with my wife to get me here, and has been with me all day. And I've enjoyed it very much and appreciate it very much. I would also like to thank whoever it is that's going to bring me some water in a minute, because I need water if I'm going to be able to do this. Human intelligence is a wonderful thing. Since many of you are students, I would guess some of you drive automobiles that have been around for a few years, and they may have those old-fashioned gas caps that aren't connected to the opening of the gas tank by that little chain or that little piece of plastic. And those of you who are older people certainly know what I'm referring to. The purpose of that chain is that so you don't put the gas cap on top of your car and drive off with the gas cap still on top of the car. I drove those old-style cars for 30-some years before there was any chain or plastic connection. And I drove off and left my gas cap on top of the roof of my car 2 or 3 times and had to go buy a new gas cap. Everybody did except your father. If your father insists that he never did this, I will take his word for it, but there were several million Americans every year who would drive off and leave their gas cap on top of the gas. Thank you, sir. Thanks. And then somebody realized that if you just connected the gas cap to the gas tank with a little chain, this problem would just go away magically. The thing is that we had been driving automobiles for a little more than 100 years before anybody figured that out. I think that's a wonderful illustration of the power of the human mind, that it just took the collective intelligence of the human race a little over 100 years to realize that there was a blindingly obvious solution to this problem. It probably adds 2 or 3 cents to the value of producing a car, however, so that it does have its downside. My view of the world, and this is not a gloomy view, is that it's actually a very optimistic view. But my view of the world is that ignorance is an ocean, and knowledge is a little island about the size of Farmville. In fact, maybe you guys are that island of knowledge. I don't know. I've never been here before. The basic thing that I want to talk about this evening is the nature of ignorance. To talk about the nature, is everybody hearing me, by the way? Then why are you still here? Oh, never mind. To talk about the nature of ignorance requires some understanding of the nature of knowledge, and that's a philosopher's job, and that's over my head. But I'm not really into knowledge. I'm more into the business of ignorance. But let me say what I have to say about knowledge as a foundation. There is no such thing as a simple or a pure concept. Every concept in the world relies on other concepts in order to make any sense. Suppose, for example, you take the concept of metal, which is about as pure and simple a concept as you can come up with. But to understand what a metal is, you have to understand concepts like solid and malleable. A stone or a rock is solid, but it's not malleable. You can't beat a rock into the shape of a car door. Not that I've tried. A metal is shiny. That's part of the definition of a metal. You can look it up. If you go back in history, you can see that the human race was actually very confused about what was a metal and what was not a metal for hundreds or thousands of years. And even today, different communities use the term metal to mean different things. Astronomers refer to everything other than hydrogen and helium as metal. A song is a fairly simple concept, but in order to understand the concept of a song, you have to understand the concept of music. And in order to understand the concept of music, you have to understand the concept of sound and the concept of purpose and organization. A pooper scooper is a really simple object, but in order to understand a pooper scooper, you have to understand a cat, and you have to understand a litter box. And every concept in the world is connected to every other concept by a string of definitions. If you're patient with me, I will explain how this connects to baseball in a few minutes. When I was young, I spent 2 summers building fences, barbed wire fences, to help keep the cows in the pasture and out of the road. When you build a fence, you put in an occasional post, a corner post or anchor post, which is much larger and more solidly put into the ground than all of the other posts. And sometimes it's also braced up by side supports. The function of these more solid posts is to keep the entire structure of a fence from giving away. If each post wobbles back and forth by 10% and then they start pulling on one another, then that 10% is going to become 20% and 30%, and in a few years the whole thing is going to fall down. If each post wobbles back and forth by that much, the fence will collapse within 5 or 10 years after it's built. But if you have an occasional post, 1 post in 10, that does not wobble, that keeps the other post from pulling on one another, and then the fence may not have to be rebuilt, if you're lucky, for 50 years. Ignorance is like that wobble on the fence post. All ideas are connected to one another like fence posts, and when there is an error or misunderstanding in the definition of one thing, it pulls on the next fence post and causes that one to wobble as well. Because all ideas are connected one to another, ignorance spreads from one definition to the next until all ideas that we have are polluted with some amount of ignorance. All people are connected one to another, so all of the bad ideas of the human race are passed from one of us to another to another. Knowledge, on the other hand, is like that occasional fence post that is sunk into the ground so solidly that it does not wobble, and thus prevents the structure from getting worse and worse, and prevents the structure from collapsing entirely. Now let me try to explain to you who I am and how I got to be standing up here in front of you guys. I started writing about baseball about 40 years ago, actually 40 years ago this summer. When I started writing about baseball, baseball had a lot of conventional wisdom, and I decided that I would try to study that conventional wisdom by scientific method. I might say that I studied baseball with a scientific method, but in truth I was never educated to be a scientist, and I have a kind of bumper sticker understanding of how science works. I have a degree in economics, and I took a few statistics classes, but I would never claim to be a real scientist. But I studied baseball as best I was able to do so, and within a couple of years I began to realize that a very large portion of baseball's conventional wisdom was just complete nonsense that wouldn't stand up to the most primitive challenges. I'll give you a simple example. When I started writing about baseball in 1975, baseball being almost universally believed that a pitcher's won-loss record was a generally reliable measure of how well he had pitched, with the exception of the fact that some pitchers pitched for good teams and other pitchers for bad teams. Everybody understood that there was some difference between winning games for a good team and winning teams for a team that wasn't so good. But if you had a better record than your team, baseball people would almost universally accept that if you pitched well. If 2 pitchers on the same team had pitched the same number of innings and allowed the same number of runs to score, but one of them had a better won-loss record than the other, it was universally accepted that the pitcher with the better record was the better pitcher. In other words, it was universally accepted that what the pitcher's won-loss record measured was real. In order to believe that, you have to believe that run support evens out over the course of a season. A starting pitcher makes about 35 starts in a full season and has about 20 to 25 decisions, although 40 years ago, when the story is centered, it was 25 or 30 decisions. Anyway, everybody knows that a starting pitcher may get 8 runs in one start and be shut out the next 2 times, just by luck. In order to believe that the won-loss record is meaningful, you have to believe that evens out over the course of a season, or at least something like evens out. Well, anyone with any familiarity with statistical analysis has to know that random effects do not even out over the course of 25 or 30 trials. Random effects do not normally even out over the course of 100 or 200 trials, but 100 or 200 is reasonable. 30 is just crazy. It isn't a debatable issue, nor does it rely on any sophisticated analysis. It's an entry-level observation. The assumption that run support evens out over the course of a season was connected by a string of wire, connected by assumption to the belief that won-loss records are meaningful. But the wobble doesn't end there. Baseball men 40 years ago generally believed that baseball was 90% pitching, or 75% pitching, or something like that. The percentages varied, but the proposition that pitching was the dominant element of the game was generally accepted. Again, this is one of those things that is fairly obviously untrue if you submit it to any kind of statistical test. But why did people believe that? It has to do with the previous misunderstanding. If you believe that the pitcher's won-loss record is an accurate measure of how he is pitched, then it follows that the pitcher can be credited with the victories and held responsible for his defeats. But how can the pitcher be held responsible for his won-loss record unless the pitcher is, in fact, the dominant element in the outcome of the game? He can't, of course. The belief that the pitcher is mostly responsible for the outcome of the game is a corollary of the belief that the won-loss record is a reliable indicator of how he is pitched, and the belief in the reliability of the won-loss record is a corollary of the belief that run support evens out over the course of a season. Ignorance spreads from one post to the next to the next. Everybody still hearing me okay? Good. I haven't had to get into my water yet, but I appreciate it also. Well, when I began building a catalog of things that in baseball's traditional wisdom and checking it out, it turned out that pretty much everything the baseball men all knew to be true was nonsense. Not all of it, but a lot of it. The reason that was true is that ignorance spreads from one post to another like a virus, and when there were no corner post in that fence to prevent the wobble from spreading from one to another, the things that passed for firm tenets of baseball's wisdom were things like baseball is 90% pitching. The whole system of understanding had collapsed because there were no corner posts that would stabilize the system. Another kind of related point about those days in the 1970s, when I was about the age of those of you coming out of school, actually I was older than you even then, but never mind, is that you wouldn't believe how many people told me that I would never make a living by doing this. I'm really interested in your work, they would say, but I don't believe that you'll ever be able to make a living doing that because there just aren't enough people who will be patient enough to sort through the data analysis with you and understand what you're saying. I remember meeting people at weddings and on the bus who would tell me that, and it was obvious to me that either the people I met were vastly different than the rest of the people around the country, or else there had to be an economically viable market for what I was trying to do. I was, in a very real sense, betting my career on the latter position, but that was never hard for me because I just couldn't imagine how I could possibly bump into 4 people every week who were interested in baseball analysis unless there were at least 10 or 15,000 such people scattered around the country. 300 million people, 1% is 3 million, 1% of those is 30,000. I don't need 30,000 readers to make a living doing this. I'm okay. I should also say that I was not the only person in the world doing this. There were actually about 6 of us who were active in 1978, but 3 of those were not very good at it. And the other two guys who were really good at it were making a good living doing other things, and they just wrote letters back and forth to one another and assumed that it was impossible to change the way that the baseball world or baseball fans thought about those issues. Anyway, within a few years, I had demonstrated to my own satisfaction that a great deal of baseball's most revered truth was in fact not true. And here's what I learned from that experience. People do not actually like being told that everything they believe is wrong. Brad Pitt said in Moneyball, referring to me, that baseball hates that guy. Well, I never actually felt that baseball hated me, but they just hated everything that I stood for. I should also point out that A, I was not right about everything. Some of what I said was not true. And B, that I was not always a model of tact and diplomacy. Actually, I was not ever a model of tact and diplomacy, but sometimes I was worse than other times. Young people are supposed to find mentors to help guide them to their success, but I could never find a mentor because, frankly, I was just too rude. People like me don't have mentors, we have parole officers. I'm not proud of this, but it is the way I was when I was young. I just was not a nice young kid from a nice family. I wasn't a bad person, but I had very rough manners. About 1983, a player named Doug Flynn became so angry with me that he stopped talking to all reporters everywhere. And when I heard about this, I said, well, I didn't say anything bad about Doug Flynn. What did I say? And when I went and looked it up, what I had said was that Doug Flynn was a horrible excuse for a Major League Baseball player. I probably shouldn't have said that, and that was far from the worst thing that I said about anybody. Again, I am not proud of this, and I have tried to learn how to do better. But when I was a young writer, being a bitter, sarcastic son of a bitch actually worked very well for me. It takes a certain kind of person to stand up and say, all of you people don't know what you're talking about. And with all of my personal failings, I was that kind of a person. The kind of person who could confront the leading experts in my field, baseball, and tell them that they were completely wrong about almost everything. Actually, I didn't usually confront them. I usually hid in my room and wrote books that told them they were wrong about it, but it has the same effect. The thing is, though, that I didn't mean to do any harm. I didn't mean to be personally offensive, even though I can look back and see that I sometimes was. And the other thing is that while standing up for unpopular truths makes you unpopular in the short run, it works very well over a long period of time. Over a long period of time, the experts got old and died, and young people take their jobs. Young people are more open to new ideas. If you tell young people that it is absurd to argue that luck evens out over the course of 30 trials, they will consider the possibility that you are right before they reject your argument. Despite my personal failings, I had succeeded in making myself a conduit for the truth. And I had done this by attaching myself to well-established facts borrowed from other academic disciplines. I didn't invent the fact that luck does not even out over the space of 30 trials. I merely stretched a wire between that easily demonstrable fact and the one-loss record of the pitcher. This created a stable corner post with which to keep the fence from wobbling. The fence from being baseball's structure and knowledge and belief. I never know where the point comes at which I've mixed my metaphors so that people aren't keeping up. By the year 2000, I had been doing what I do for about 25 years. Most of the old guys that I had annoyed when I was young were retired or gone, and their jobs had been taken by people who were younger than I was, and who had found through their own experiences that many of the things I said were true. And I promise, later on I will talk about one or two of the things that I was wrong about. By now, 2015, there are literally thousands of people who make a living doing exactly the things that people told me I would never be able to make a living doing. They have their own conventions, God knows how many conventions every year, attended by thousands of people. Many of those people have technical skills that far surpass my own, and they do what I did far better than I could ever have done it myself. Many of the things that I argued in the 1970s are now absolutely universally accepted in baseball. There is now a large, well-organized community of baseball analysts. Other things that I argued in the 1970s and 1980s I've had to rethink. And there are also things that I learned many years ago which are now accepted within that community, but about which we have made no progress in convincing other baseball men. For example, baseball men believe that when you put a good hitter behind another good hitter, the second hitter protects the first one, and that will make the first one a better hitter. It is easy to demonstrate that this is not true, and we did demonstrate that 30 years ago and any number of times since, but the baseball establishment still believes that it does. We just haven't found the way to connect this to the network of knowledge and get buy-in from it. The thing is, though, that ignorance is inexhaustible. We may have 1,000 people working on getting rid of it. It doesn't make much of a dent. I have been given a great deal of credit for the few wires that I have been able to attach between hard knowledge and baseball's belief system. But what you have to understand is that compared to the amount of ignorance that still exists, it's nothing. Bertrand Russell wrote in Philosophy for Laymen that what philosophy should attack is not ignorance, but certainty. Certainty protects ignorance. Certainty is the sword and shield of ignorance. If I had realized you guys were the Lancers, I would have said the lance and shield of ignorance. Russell wrote that suppose that Mr. Muggle's followers believe him to have been a god. You would be justified in arguing against them because if you are wrong and they are right, no real harm will have been done by that. But you would not be justified in burning them at the stake because the evil of being burned at the stake is much more certain than any proposition of philosophy. Certainty is the immediate cause of the most awful injustices in the world. There has been a news story within the last week or so to the effect that the FBI forensics experts on hair comparison analysis have been lying to help convict people on terrible crimes for the last 30 years. It is very common for hairs of an unknown origin to be found at the scene of a crime. I would guess that this happens in about 80% of crime scenes or murder scenes or more. If you can connect a hair found at the scene of a crime to a suspect, that becomes a very big deal. It now develops that of the 28 hair comparison specialists employed by the FBI's forensics laboratory, 26 have been going into trials and exaggerating what they actually knew. They claim that they were certain that this hair came from that suspect, when actually there is no method other than DNA by which hairs can be scientifically matched with any real reliability. FBI agents have testified improperly in thousands of cases over a long period of time, almost always on behalf of the prosecution, and now, as a society, we're going to have to deal with the fallout from that. You might wonder how in the hell something like that can happen. Well, here is how it happened. As a person who reads crime books, I have known since the early 1970s that hair comparison analysis was speculative and not reliable, and this was the accepted view of the 1970s. In the mid-1980s, however, a terrible villain in Atlanta was murdering children. They had a suspect, and we know now that they probably had the right suspect because there's now some DNA evidence against him. But at the time, they had very little real evidence against him. They had to do something to stop him from getting out and murdering more children. So they rounded up some fiber analysis experts, hair analysis, and argued that the hairs were microscopically identical to hairs found on one or two of the victims. The hairs were found on the victims after they'd been pulled out of a river, but still, that was what they had, and they ran with it. And it worked. At the time, I thought, wait a minute, why are they putting all this weight on hair comparison? I thought everybody knew that was sub-scientific BS. But I assumed that there must have been advancements in the field that I was unaware of that would justify this testimony. And it worked. They were able to convict Wayne Williams of being the Atlanta child killer. Well, after it worked once, they became a little bit more bold and aggressive in using hair comparisons analysis in another case, and another case, and another case. After a period of years, the experts in the field became certain that they knew things that just weren't true at all. It turned out that there hadn't been any advancements in the field whatsoever, and it wasn't until somebody tested them and said, okay, smart guy, look at these hairs and tell me which ones came from the same person, that their bosses realized that they were just making it up. Injustice results from certainty. Certainty is the sword and shield of injustice, of ignorance. Wars result from many different things, but one of the key things that creates war is certainty. The certainty that we are right and they are wrong. Ignorance without certainty will collapse like a wobbly fence. Ignorance braced up by self-righteousness can do immeasurable harm. Let me tell you then one of the things that I was wrong about years ago. Years ago, myself and many others in my field would ridicule the concepts of team chemistry, leadership, and the role of character in winning championships. It's not that we argued that these things did not exist exactly. It is more that we would make fun of the concepts. Maybe we were justified in doing that to an extent because leadership and chemistry have long been used by old school analysts as what we would call, pardon my French, bullshit dumps. Whatever happened that could not be explained in any other way would be explained by leadership and character. The people in my field tend to be obsessed with data points. Where is this chemistry, we would demand to know? Where is the evidence for it? Can you tell us who will have good chemistry next season? But that argument is completely wrong and completely wrong-headed, and let me try to explain why. What is meant by chemistry in a locker room is simply that the interactive process among the players makes them better or does not make them better. Well, look at your own life. Do the people that you live with and work with have the capacity to make you a better worker or to make you a less productive worker? Of course they do. If the other people in your department are helpful or are not helpful, does that have an impact on what you can do? If you are at a class with a bunch of dolts, do you get as much out of that class as you would get out of the class with a group of bright, energetic, motivated people? Being surrounded by supportive colleagues is helpful everywhere in the world. Why would the sports world be an exception? A baseball team, far from being an exception to this rule, is an extreme example of this phenomena. Baseball players eat together, travel together, stay in the same hotels, fly on the same airplanes, work together in an interactive way, and are together virtually every day for 200 plus consecutive days with very, very, very few days off. It is the most community-oriented experience that you can imagine. We used to ask, show us where this chemistry is, show us who is helped by it, and show us the results. And then one day I looked at the problem in exactly the right way, and there it is, as big as an elephant. Team chemistry can be found, and eventually we will be able to measure it, in the relationship between potential and production. We have been missing this for years because after the fact, we only look at production. We tend to assume that after the fact, potential is no longer relevant. But players in any sport do not produce at the full level of their potential very often. If you have 30 players on a team, 2 or 3 of them in any season are going to have as good a season as they realistically could have had. Overall, the players on a baseball team will accomplish about 50% of what they would seem at the start of the year to have the potential to accomplish. At this time of the year, in April, we might think that Brian Harper will hit 45 homers, and this is the year that Steven Strasburg will win the Cy Young Award, and this is the year that Ryan Zimmerman will snap back to the player he used to be. But when you get into October, we will see that about half of what could have happened didn't happen. Chemistry is in that space, that relationship between potential and production. If a team with average potential achieves 60% of what the individuals on the team are capable of achieving in baseball, that will be enough to make that team a very serious contender. If they achieve 65% of their potential, they're going to win. This is not to say that other things are not also important. Of course, the team that has great potential may be able to win the championship by achieving 45% of their potential, and the Philadelphia Phillies might not be able to win anything this season if they achieve 80% of their potential. So I was just blind on that issue. I was ignorant. I'm still ignorant today about many, many issues. Ignorance is all around us. We are swimming in ignorance, trying to reach that small island of knowledge. I took the habits of thought of an economist and applied them to baseball. My friend Nate Silver, who founded 538.com, took the habits of thought from baseball analysis and has applied them to politics. I asked Nate whether he would agree that 95% of the professional political analysis that you see in the media is just ridiculous nonsense, to which he replied, oh, it's much more than 95%. Nate claims that the structure of knowledge and ignorance that professional political analysts use to comment on elections on their own field is much worse than it ever was in baseball. Ignorance is all around us, and this is a great thing for you if you believe in knowledge. Every bit of traditional wisdom that turns out to be nonsense is an opportunity for you to make the world a better place and to make a living by doing it. Ignorance is a gold mine, and there's so much of it. So what I would have to say to you is just grab your shovel and dive in anywhere. It's an ocean. You can't miss. I'm done. Okay, this is my first opportunity ever to ask this. Are there any ignorant questions? I'm just kidding. Are there any questions? Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
How did you deal with people doubting you that you couldn't make a career out of this?
Well, can you all still hear me?
Yeah.
I wasn't like a nice kid. I mean, I was an angry young man, and I was used to people. I was raised that way. My father was a small town school janitor. You know how the kids get treated? I was used to it. The Lord designed me for this function. And I'm not saying I would want somebody else to be that way, but that's the way I was. Yeah.
My name is Karen Sharma. I'm about to graduate from Simkins down the road over there. Thank you for being here. I'm a big fan of baseball, big fan of yours, and I'm a proud member of Sabre. But I got pretty geeked when I heard that you were coming. I called into MLB on XM this morning. I asked Steve Phillips what I should ask you. And what he told me was, Paul DiPodesto once said that if it's not quantifiable, it doesn't matter. So what are some statistics that you look at? You talked about chemistry for a little bit, but what are some like non-statistical categories that you look at, intangibles, maybe even in a baseball player when you're evaluating position players?
Well, if it's not quantifiable, that just means that it's not quantifiable yet. Doesn't mean it won't be quantifiable next year. The real question is not what do we know, it's what are we missing. And the question that drives research always is not what is the value of all this stuff we know. The value of what we know will manifest itself because there's money in it. That's the theme of Moneyball. The real question is what are we missing? What do we not know? So I would argue with DiPodesto, and I would point out that that's exactly the sort of chemistry comment that I was talking about. People in my field are skeptical of that because they can't measure it. Lots of things exist that we can't measure. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi, Bill. This earlier this week, I was actually reading Forbes, and they actually quoted. I didn't know this until you just mentioned it. Your friend Nate Silver, and he actually was talking to a group of 13-year-old kids in 8th grade that were starting to use a similar metric per se for basketball.
Uh-huh.
Do you believe that your beliefs, as an econ major, I do believe that other sports could also learn from what you have taught baseball?
They have. There are hundreds of people who do what I do in baseball, and some of them making a very, very good living doing it in basketball.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, they were doing basketball, but I was thinking, could you also do that in, like, per se, football, hockey, tennis?
It's been done or attempted in every sport there is.
Okay.
It's just the science of, economics is the science of value. It's saying how many of these equal one of those, right? And how many runs are equal to a win. Those questions exist in every sport, and answers to them exist everywhere. It's just a matter of attacking the inexhaustible ignorance with enough self-confidence to, you can do it. Yes?
What sparked your love of baseball?
Baseball cards. Post cereals in the spring of 1961 put baseball cards on the back of their cereals. I'd never heard of baseball cards before, and I was just absolutely captivated by them. And so I like to say I was captured by a stack of baseball cards at the age of 11, and I never escaped. So, yes, sir.
I just wanted to know how close you worked with Theo Epstein, if at all, since he gets a lot of credit for building those Red Sox championships.
I mean, Theo was in charge. I worked for. I mean, I didn't report to Theo. I actually reported to the owner, but I functionally reported to Theo most of the time. I mean, Theo made all of the important decisions. I didn't make any of them, but I worked with Theo very closely when he was with the Red Sox. Yes, sir.
You made the statement about protecting, having a good hitter and having another
Right.
really good hitter behind him. I was thinking about the Detroit Tigers this year. A number of us are fans of the Tigers, and they talk about it all the time around Cabrera.
Right.
With Victor Martinez,
Right.
and so I was really struck by this, and it's such common rhetoric in baseball that I'm going, oh gosh, what's the problem with that?
Right.
So I don't know if it's connected to the fence post or not, but I mean, what's the deal with that?
Well, I happen to know that if you take Victor Martinez away, Cabrera's a 220 hitter. Just kidding. Part of it comes from the baseball players are trained, athletes are trained from early on to give credit to those around them. And the main thing you learn from working in sports is how many people it takes to win a championship. And you learn not to try to take credit for yourself. I've always been given more credit than I deserved. I've been given more credit than I deserved for the Red Sox, for the development of sabermetrics, for my analytical skills. I've always been given more credit than I deserved. But you learn not to try to take credit. So the hitter says, you sign another great hitter, then it's his instinct. I'll give credit to him. It's a way of passing credit to a teammate. The fact that it's total nonsense, well, it gets lost. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I have a two-part question. First off, does Pete Rose belong in the Hall of Fame? And second off, do the steroid era guys like the Sosas, McGuires, the Piazzas, do they belong in the Hall of Fame?
The penalty that Rose has paid for the offense that he committed seems to me disproportionate. It seems to me that he did wrong, and having done wrong, he then dug his own grave and buried himself. He wouldn't admit that he'd done wrong, and although he was for a long time a very well liked in baseball, he made himself a pariah by the way he acted. And it's created this, people have gotten blind to the fact that the punishment fits the crime. I'll write about the steroid issue at some point. Baseball players from a very, very early age do everything they can to be, all athletes do everything they can to be the best athletes they can. And you're told, you know, take this course, lift these weights, eat this, don't eat that, show up, play at this level, play in this league, buy this equipment, and they do all of that. And then somebody says, take these pills, they'll make you a better player. At the time that that came into baseball, taking the pills wasn't illegal, and it wasn't cheating in any meaningful sense at all. I don't feel that I was cheated in any way by the players who used steroids. I don't hold any grudge against them. To me, it's water under the bridge, and it seems terribly sad that the greatest pitcher I've ever seen, Roger Clemens, is being held out of the Hall of Fame because people think he probably used steroids. He probably didn't knowingly use steroids. His personal trainer was injecting him with steroids and telling him it was vitamins. And maybe he's not the brightest bulb in the world. But I personally think we have to get, for one thing, there are 6 or 8 people who are obvious steroid users who are already in the Hall of Fame. And there are going to be a lot more. They're just the ones who never admitted that they used steroids and never got caught. So do you want a world in which the guys who successfully cheat are eligible for the honor, but the guys who, that's how I feel about it. I know people who work in baseball who totally disagree with me, and that's fine. I'm not trying to persuade anyone to see it the way I do. If you see it different, that's fine. The way I see it, people who were cheating in order to try to be better players, that's not really cheating. That's the way I see it. Yes, sir.
Hi, Sam Silverman, also from Kansas City. I just have a question about trying to go through. You quantified a lot of things, a lot of statistics and factors that people just before you just hadn't quantified.
Right.
And I'm in the process of building my own metric for trying to come up with a reasonable projection for how long it takes from a player being drafted to being MLB ready.
Uh-huh.
It seems like there are several problems with figuring out how to quantify a lot of this data.
Right.
Talk about how you quantified a lot of data that seemingly was unquantified before.
That's the central challenge of what we do, is figuring out how to challenge something. The question is, does something have an effect? If it has an effect, you look at the effect. The times that you really feel smart are when you find not effects but side effects. If you can find side effects, then a lot of times the side effects may be quantifiable even though the direct effects are not. But all I can really tell you is that you just have to look for the just look for the effects of whatever it is, the thing that you're trying to isolate and measure. Excuse me, I got to take a drink of water, or there's going to be a bad effect from that if I don't. Yes, sir.
I've always been more intrigued about sort of social issues in sports, what you play throughout. When you made comments around the time of the Joe Paterno case, following the free report, and whatnot,
Right.
and everything, did you feel, I know you just mentioned about credit, did you feel sort of discredited when the Red Sox came out and sort of made their statement based on other issues you've done? Do you feel that they kind of only took you for the baseball side?
The Red Sox statement was made because we have our own issues. And they asked me not to comment on the subject, and I agreed not to comment on the subject, so I won't. Yes, sir.
I think sometimes when we get close to a topic analytically or statistically, there's a risk of losing our passion about it. So I'm just curious if you find yourself as passionate about baseball now as you were when you were that kid looking at baseball cards. And I'm also curious as to, regardless of the statistical side of things, if there are players over the years that just have become particular favorites of yours,
Oh, yeah.
regardless of the statistical side.
Yeah, I find that the more I know about baseball, I think it's generally true that the more you know about something, the more interesting it seems, and the information you find interesting is the information that stands next to the information you already have. And I always found that the more I know about baseball, the more interesting it seems. And actually what I've loved about working with the Red Sox is I've been able to work with people who, I go to games and I sit next to the scouts a lot. Scouts see the game so different than I do, but I learn a lot from sitting there with them. And the things I learn from sitting there with them make the game more enjoyable to me. Have I lost passion? I've gained passion. It's a momentum thing to me. And you have, I mean, there are players you dislike and players you just don't like. I mean, and you have to kind of, when you work in the game, you have to kind of separate that. And we have a chance to trade for a player, and it's like, I never liked that guy. It's not a good answer. You have to find it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the win-loss record for pitchers. What do you think is the most overrated traditional batting statistic out there?
Well, it changes all the time, but it used to be that people confused a good batting average with a good hitter. And so batting average was by far the most overrated stat. But that's not really true anymore. So I don't know. I mean, people overrate counting stats as opposed to production stats. You know, you can drive in 100 runs, and if it's just a matter of you're batting with 300 runners on base, doesn't necessarily mean anything. But I don't know if that's a good answer or not. Yes.
I read an article, someone was talking about Denard's span and his performance in the outfield. And they were saying that, he wasn't as great an outfielder as some of his fans really thought about
right.
it, based on his presence in the outfield, his abilities. Do you think that players take these statistics very seriously and adjust their training and practice and the way that they play in their games? Are they taking it seriously, or is it more like a...
Denard Span, by the way, is one of my favorite players. I love Denard Span. He's just fun to watch, and I agree that he's overrated defensively. He's not as good as people think he is, but he's just a lot of fun. I like him. Positive person also. He's an upbeat person. He's somebody we'd be happy to have on a team. It's not that players react directly to anything I write or anybody in my field writes, but they react all the time to what they hear from coaches and teammates, and if you're told, I mean, you're in a profession where you could make $20 million a year, and if you're 90% of that guy who makes $20 million a year, you're lucky to be in the profession at all, and you might be making $40,000 a year in the minors. So you have the chance to take a step up. People are going to do anything they have to do to take that step up, and there aren't any exceptions. It gets back to the steroid issue I was talking about before. But people think that the ethic of sport, the ethic of sport is not that you do anything you can do within the rules to win. It's that you do anything you can do to win. I mean, that is the way we are. You're going to do anything you can do to win. And it's the job of athletic directors and coaches and other people in authority to make sure you stay within the rules. But athletes are going to do anything they can do to take that small step from being the player who makes $40,000 a year to the player who makes $18 million a year. That's just the fact of life. Yeah.
Yeah, you said there was players who just like the players who just don't like.
Yeah. My favorite player of all time? I loved Minnie Minoso. Loved Ron Santo. Amos Otis from the 1970s Kansas City A's was my favorite player on that team. Hal McRae was on that team. I loved Craig Biggio. David Ortiz, certainly. Petey, Dustin Pedroia. Who's your favorite player? Didn't expect me to come back at you, did you? Yes, sir.
When you were doing your historical baseball abstract and applying your statistical analysis to players all the way back from the beginning of the game, did anything particularly startle you about a player? Did you find that there was a player that we particularly underestimate or have overestimated from the past?
Yeah. In fact, there was somebody just like last week that I looked at and thought, damn, I never realized this guy was as good as this. Now I can't remember who it was. But, you know, I've been studying it for so long that you have those little breakthroughs, and then you think you've always known this. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Ron Santo. I'm a huge Cubs fan, so I'm curious your opinion. Is Epstein going to be able to bring a championship to Chicago soon?
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's a world championship, I don't know. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the postseason, but he's going to have the Cubs in the playoffs every year within no later than 2018. You guys are going to be in the playoffs every year. Yes, sir.
So what I always thought was intriguing about your career and Moneyball and all that is that, and as you've been talking about, is how much the experts believe they know.
Right.
And sometimes they just don't.
Uh-huh.
And you have applied this a lot to baseball and people say countless other sports. But what's your take on sort of outside of sports? And do you, for example, are you uncomfortable when you go to the doctor and they said, well, I'm convinced it's this or that or something like that, where?
Well, I'll tell you a conversation that I had a little bit of earlier today, and I had the same conversation with my doctor last time I was there. My doctor reads my book, so he'll take time to actually talk to me. I said, can you believe that medical journals publish results with a 95% confidence level? Doesn't that just seem to you like it's crazy? So we had an argument. A lot of complete nonsense gets published in medical journals because they use a 95% confidence level to. I have no idea why they do that. The direct answer to your question is yes, I see everything. I mean, my last book was about crime. When you read crime books, they're full of the same sorts of self-satisfied nonsense that baseball was full of 40 years ago and is to an extent. And it's not that I'm not in any way knocking on lawyers or anything, but lawyers go on TV and talk about crime shows, and they just say stupid stuff that you would think that anybody would have would be inclined to question and quarrel with. There aren't that many people. Most people just go along and get along. I mean, most people just roll with the punches. There aren't that many of us who. But yes, I see the world the same way. I see ignorance all around me. I try to avoid being cantankerous about it because I have lots of other things to be cantankerous about. But that is the way the world. I see everything. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Would you say in getting Hamlin Ramirez the Red Sox?
I had a say in the sense that I talk to people.
Do you like him as a player?
I could never tell you if I didn't, because I mean, discussions within the Red Sox are private, but certainly I participated in that discussion, and I told them what I thought, but I can't talk about private and recent team discussions in public. Yes, sir.
One stat that's got a lot of attention this year and last year is length of games.
Right.
And I know you've written and proposed some rule changes in the past to try to make the games move along quicker. I wonder what you think about the current rule changes that they've implemented for this season. How effective you think they'll be at increasing?
Well, I was skeptical. You could tell the difference. I've seen several games this year already. You can tell the difference. You can tell the guys don't step out of the box and wander around quite as much as you can see the game moving along a little bit better. But that again is another area like what I've been talking about. The solution to this is obvious. I mean, anybody who looks at it knows what the problem is. The batters get out of the box and wander around, and the breaks between innings, which used to be 90 seconds, are now 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes, and they change pitchers all the time. So anybody knows needs to be done. It's just a question of doing it. Yes.
Having lived through the golden age of ignorance of baseball, and now it's
to have to have a college degree sometimes to follow the draft day and ESPN and also that process. Do you find that the younger generation is as interested in the game through the enjoyment aspect of it, or more as a statistical?
Well, the way that people enjoy the game changes, and if it ever stops changing, then the game dies. I mean, the movie business is totally different than it was 40 years ago. The music industry is totally different. The newspaper industry, if the way that people enjoy the products ceases to change all the time, then the product's going to die, because we don't carry things on forever in the same form. Yes, sir.
Would it be too diplomatic to say that these people with certainty are not so much wrong as oversimplifying something that is very complicated, and that you're revealing a reality that they just don't get?
No, I don't agree with that at all. The problem is not oversimplification, it's certainty. I mean, the great problem in politics is self-righteousness. And self-righteousness is merely a form of certainty. If people would simply admit that they don't understand, that problems are more complicated than we understand, but instead the people in politics have to pretend that they have this all figured out on both sides of the issue, and that certainty is what, to my mind, is what creates the problem. The last 15 questions that I've taken have all been from men, I believe. So if there's a woman somewhere who would like to ask a question, I will take that question, and then I will get off the stage and let anybody who wants to get out of here, get out of here. I see some women with their hands halfway up. All right.
Just a kind of general question. What are your thoughts on fantasy baseball?
Did you see the article in the New Yorker last week about fantasy baseball was more or less invented by Dan Okran, and Dan was in my house telling me about fantasy baseball 4 months after he invented it. Didn't seem like such a big deal at the time. And Dan is quoted in that article in the New Yorker as saying that he really feels terrible about having invented fantasy baseball, and because it's in certain ways a corrupting influence. People don't enjoy the game in the same form they used to. What I'm going to say to him the next time I see him is, a door that opens to let people out also opens to let people in. Fantasy baseball is a way that people enjoy the game, and it's drawn millions of people into the game, and that's a great thing. And I don't have any mixed feelings about it at all. It's not. I don't write about fantasy baseball. I never write about fantasy baseball. I'm not interested in it. But I don't see it as this terrible thing either. Thank you for the question. Thank you all for being here. And